My name is Kim Smith, and I'm a retired circuit judge from Fayetteville, Arkansas. I was born in Joplin, Missouri in 1949 and went all through public schools in Joplin and went to 2 years of college in Joplin at Missouri Southern, and then transferred to the University of Missouri my junior year and graduated from the University of Missouri in 1971 with a BSBA in marketing.
Where did you go to law school? Tell me about that.
All right. Well, in 1971, I was graduating from the University of Missouri with a marketing degree, and I'd applied to law schools at Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas. I never heard from Kansas, thank goodness, but I was on the waiting list at the University of Missouri, but Arkansas said, come on down, we'd like to have you. And also that spring I got a draft notice. I had a low number in the lottery, the draft lottery that occurred in '69. And I mentioned that to my cousin that I've been accepted to law school at Arkansas, but I had a draft obligation I was going to join the Army or the Air Force, and he told me they had an opening at the National Guard Armory there in Joplin. And I went down and talked to them, and they said, yeah, we'd like to have you. And in fact, you can go to law school and come up here on the weekends when we have our drills and drill in your blue jeans. So I did that, and then in May of '72, I went to Fort Leonard Wood and did my basic training, AIT, until October. And law school had started back, of course, in late August and early September, so I had to lay out that second year. And so I drove a beer truck for about 10 months and met my wife and got married in '73 and came back to law school.
Tell me about your parents and your family growing up. Who were your parents, or where'd y'all grow up?
My mom and dad were C.O. Smith Jr. His name is Comma Oscar. And my mother, Virginia Martin Smith from Joplin, whose dad owned the Caterpillar dealership there in Joplin and Springfield. And she told him, we're not going to have a third. There's not going to be a third Comma Oscar Smith anyway. So they named me Kim Martin. And I had a brother and a sister, and my sister still lives in Joplin, and my brother's deceased. And I had a fun time growing up in Joplin, played all the sports. I was kind of real small for my age. I was about 5'6" when I got a driver's license when I was 16. And I had to play on the light team in ninth grade football because I only weighed about 130 pounds. But anyway, I loved playing sports and played a bunch of sports there in Joplin, and was real fortunate to come down here to Fayetteville. We just love it.
Talk about when you came to Fayetteville, what it was like and what you did.
Well, it was pretty small, and when I came back married in '73, I'd already had 1 year of law school. We lived at Carlson Terrace, the married student housing over there. And my wife had gotten a teaching degree from Missouri Southern in Joplin, and we naively thought she could just come down here and get a teaching job. We didn't know everybody that graduated from University of Arkansas in teaching wanted to stay around the Fayetteville area, or most of them. And so she worked for Brown and Deskin, a CPA firm, and my second year of law school, a friend of mine, Chester Bogus, had been clerking for the county prosecutor's office. Malin Gibson was the elected prosecutor, and he said, you ought to go down there and see if you can get a job. They've got some LEA money, law enforcement administration money. They were throwing a lot of money at crime back in those days. And he's got a grant to have some law clerk, or 2 law clerks. So I went down to his office, and they had a grand jury going on. And for about 2 weeks, I went down there and waited, trying to get a chance to talk to him. see if I could get a job. And finally one day he came in, he got out of court, and I talked with him and told him, you know, a little bit about myself. And I said, you know, I'll work for a week or two for free if you don't think I can do the job, well, tell me to go on down the road. And anyway, he gave me a job as a law clerk. And then when I was getting ready to graduate from law school in May of '75, he applied for a grant and got the second deputy prosecutor spot. Up to that point, Malin had Ron McCann was a full-time deputy prosecutor for him. And so he got another LEA grant and hired me as the second deputy prosecutor. So I started in the fall of '75 when I passed the bar. I was a deputy prosecutor. And then I did that till 1979. In '78, Malin Gibson was going to run for judge because Judge Cummings, Maupin Cummings, was retiring. And so the other deputy at that time was Chester Boggess. And so Chester and I both wanted to be the prosecutor. And so we ran against each other in the Democratic primary in 1978. And I squeaked by, I barely beat him. He was beating me bad over in Madison County, and those were the first returns in for some reason. And thought this isn't going to work. But anyway, I barely beat Chester, and then later on he came to work for me as the deputy prosecutor, and we were good friends. But so then I was the elected prosecutor from 1979 through 1986 when I took the bench. And I was just 30 years old when I took the office, and I had 5 capital murder trials the first year I was the elected prosecutor. And, you know, I was just still wet behind the ears trying these, James Ray Renton and Harold Davy Cassell were charged with killing Officer John Hussey back in '75, but we didn't get them to trial till '79 because it took a while to catch them and then getting ready for a capital murder trial. So I tried those 2, and they both got convicted and received life without parole sentences. And then Shirley Marie Curry, I don't know if you remember that lady, she killed her 3 children, an ex-husband and an ex-sister-in-law, and wounded an ex-brother-in-law. And I tried her that year and a couple other cases. But I really enjoyed being the prosecuting attorney and, you know, representing victims in court and trying to get justice for those that have been wronged by other people.
Tell me about when you first started, what it was like working for Malin Gibson, and what your caseload was like.
Well, working for Malin Gibson was a real treat, and he taught me how to get a case ready for trial, go through your witnesses, go through the elements of the crime. I remember one of my first trials was a theft case. And to be a felony at that time, John Threet says it was like $5, but it was really about $50, I think. If you had to steal over $50 to be a felony. Now it's probably $500 or $1,000, I'm not sure. I hadn't looked that up in a long time. But anyway, I was trying this theft case and went back to the desk and asked Malin if there was anything else I ought to ask. And he said, well, you might want to prove how much the item was valued to be able to make it a felony instead of a misdemeanor. So that was a good lesson. So you write down all the elements of the offense and make sure you put all that in the evidence, you know. Because if not, then you're going to get a directed verdict on some issues. But he taught me how to try a case, and he let me second chair him in a lot of trials. So I had a real good teacher, and he and I tried several murder cases together. And the big French drug case happened, well, when I was a law clerk. They had the search warrant out on on a farm and found, I think it was 10 tons of marijuana was flown in here from Barranquilla, Colombia. They flew it into Salas, Oklahoma, and trucked it over here to a barn in Washington County. And I got to help try some of those cases. Out of that case was a big one. But Malin taught me, how to be a good prosecutor and fair. And I never tried anybody that wasn't convinced myself was guilty. I wanted to make sure I never prosecuted an innocent person. And I'm sure there's some out there that says I did, but the evidence I had, I didn't. In fact, I dropped a murder case that a man had been convicted, that I got convicted of a second-degree murder, and later the case got overturned on a evidentiary ruling, and we're getting ready to try it again, and I was not convinced he did it this time. There was some new evidence that surfaced, and I didn't try him again for murder. But I sure enjoyed my time with Malin and my time as the elected prosecutor. So I was the elected prosecutor 8 years here in Washington County and Madison County. When I first took office in '79, Madison County was put in our district. So I'd go over there and try cases too.
Talk about your successor at the prosecutor's office. Who came next, and what did they do?
The next prosecutor was Andrew Zeiser. He'd been a deputy for me, and also a deputy for me was Kit Williams, who's the city attorney. You know Kit, I'm sure. And they both decided they wanted to be prosecutors, so they ran against each other, and Andrew beat Kit by a little bit. So Andrew was the prosecutor, I think, either 2 or 4 years, a short term. And then Terry Jones ran for prosecutor, and I don't think he had an opponent when he ran. And then, of course, after Terry was John Threet, who's now on the bench, and he was a good prosecutor. I presided over some of his trials when I was a judge. I tried some criminal cases, but as a judge, mostly I tried civil cases. I took Judge Jameson's place when he retired. I was fortunate enough to get elected. My old fishing buddy, Bob I. Mays, ran against me for judge. And I said, Bob, we don't want to run against each other. This is the only time we've got. And I said, all right. So I barely beat him, and I know I beat him, but in any way, he was a real good fella. But we both wanted that job, and I got by him and was the circuit judge when I was 38 years old. And then, so I was circuit judge 26 years. And I want to tell you about a lady that was with me when I was the prosecutor and the judge. Her name is Joan Lester. And Joni, I knew, she used to work at the county courthouse for Vol Lester while she was in high school. And then I think she worked in someone's office. And anyway, I'd met Joan somewhere from the courthouse, and I needed a secretary, and so I hired Joan as my secretary about March. I took office in January of '79, and about March of '79, I hired Joni, I think it was March or May, to be my secretary. And so she was secretary for me all the 8 years I was prosecutor. And when I was elected to the bench, she came over as my trial court assistant, took care of everything and kept the cases moving. And she really had a real good system on making sure the docket didn't get stuck or, didn't get behind. That we tried to keep the cases current as we could. And she was a great hand. So she worked for me a total of 34 years. And when I was on the bench, I hired Karen Morrow, who had been a secretary for Malin Gibson when he was prosecutor when I was a law student. And I'd known Karen, and she'd become a court reporter. And so I offered her the court reporting job when I was elected judge, and she took it, and she was my court reporter for 26 years. In fact, she's still a court reporter for Judge Martin. Both she and Jones stayed when Judge Doug Martin was elected. They both stayed with him. And now Joni has since retired, but Karen's still there. And I forgot to answer your question about the caseload when I first was with Malin. It was not anything near what it is now. You know, I knew every policeman at Fayetteville PD and Springdale PD and every Washington County deputy. And now, you know, that's just quadrupled or more than that probably. I think there's 20 in the prosecutor's office maybe, or counting other helpers in the prosecutor's office. But back then it wasn't quite as many cases as there are now, but we kept busy. But
you were a judge for many, many years. What are some of the cases that stand out? Maybe some of the most notable ones.
Well, probably the most complicated was the from out at your area, the Prairie Grove chicken feed cases, where the allegations were that the arsenic in Roxar zone, which was a compound they mixed with chicken feed to keep the salmonella down. The theory of the plaintiffs was this Roxar zone that contained arsenic to such a level that it was causing a cancer cluster down there of children and adults in the Prairie Grove area. And we tried that for 3 weeks, once against the manufacturer Roxar zone, and then the next trial was against the chicken companies, Tyson, George's, and Simmons over at Siloam, and I think there was another one. Anyway, so we had 2 3-week trials with that in a civil case. Another big civil case I had was David Stills had accusations against a Springdale businessman named Joe Edwards that kidnapped him at gunpoint, took him to his house, and was going to go get his wife, and act like he was going to pour arsenic or some kind of chemicals on his face, and didn't. And then while Mr. Edwards was gone to pick up his wife, because he thought his wife and David Stills were having an affair, and his wife was in her 50s and David was in his early 20s. And anyway, he was having some mental issues, I think. But we tried the civil case in my court, and there was a big verdict for several $1 million. I can't remember exactly what the verdict was, but that was a big case that I remember. Several big malpractice cases that we tried, and I was trying to think back. Those are the main ones that stand out to me.
Talk about some of the county officials that you dealt with. Obviously, you dealt with the clerk's office and others. Talk about some of the county officials that you remember and what they were like.
When I first started, Alma Kohlmeyer was the Washington County Circuit Clerk, and that's where we filed criminal charges by means of an information signed by the prosecutor or a deputy prosecutor to you didn't have to have a grand jury indict people in Arkansas. The prosecutor could make a charging decision. And so we'd file those criminal informations with Alma Kohlmeyer and get arrest warrants through her office, the circuit clerk. Let's see, after Alma was Kathleen Harness. Yeah, Mac Harness and I were buddies playing softball together, and he had a boat and used to take me fishing. Well, Malin took me fishing a bunch too, taught me how to fish. But anyway, Kathleen Harness followed Alma, and she was a circuit clerk, both very nice ladies. Alma passed away, I think, last year, or maybe 2 years ago, and I didn't get to go to her funeral. But So I worked a lot with them, and Kay Hanks was a deputy clerk for Alma that I worked a lot with Kay. And let's see, Vol Lester, when I was a law student working for Maitland, was the county judge. Bill Long was the sheriff back in those, when Vol Lester was the county judge. Bill Long was the sheriff, and then after Bill Long was Herb Marshall. And then after Herb Marshall was Bud Dennis. And then I think I was out of the prosecutor's office after that.
Tell me again a little bit about what the sheriffs were like dealing with as the prosecutor.
Oh, they were usually good to work with, and their deputies, you know. I tried to have a meeting. I'd get a case, and all the law enforcement people that were going to testify, I'd meet with them individually and say, here's what I understand from your reports you know about this case, and make sure it was, their memory was right, and that's what it was. Once in a while somebody forget to put something in a report. I had a murder case. Another big case when I was prosecutor was Paul Muller was murdered by a man named Rodney Britton. And I tried, Mr. Britton was killed in a shootout after the murder of Paul Muller, Chief Muller at West Fork. And a man that was with Rodney Britton was named Billy Gale Henry. And so I tried him, and we were in the middle of a trial, and some deputy came up to me on a break and said, you know, he told me he did it or was involved in this thing. I said, no, you didn't put it in a report. It's too late now. We have discovery. We have to turn those things over, any exculpatory or incriminating evidence. The other side has a right to have it and know about it. I said, it's too late now. We can't use that at trial right now. Anyway, but they were mostly good to make good reports and meet with me and get ready for trial.
What were the challenges that you faced as a prosecutor that your successor had to face? Obviously, you know, probably shorthanded maybe, but what
Right.
was the problems?
Well, you know, you'd always like more help and more we didn't have our own investigator in the prosecutor's office back in those days. I hired some part-time help when I was prosecutor. I was able to get a little money from the quorum court, and I had a part-time investigator. Larry McCauley worked for me. He was a retired Fayetteville police officer, and so we were able to get him. And I was able to use Jeff Harper when he was in law school. Judge Harper, he's now the Springdale Division of the Washington County District Court up in Springdale. And then Mike Blocker worked for me when he clerked for me, worked as a part-time investigator for me while he was going to law school. He'd been a detective on the Springdale Police Department that he and I went to Oklahoma and helping put together the trial against James Ray Renton and Harold Davy Cassell. He'd done a lot of the investigation. Dick O'Connell with the FBI played a big role in that case, and also the Perry robbery case. Dick O'Connell and I went to Louisiana and New York, and we traveled to talk to witnesses and things on that case. But you know, you just like to have more help and more investigative tools. We were just a one-man operation, or three people, and you know, we'd talk to farmers that come in to complain about dogs killing their cattle, and you know, we'd tell them what their rights are under the law, and just all kinds of complaints. You'd sit down and spend your time talking to people coming in to complain about their spouse sometimes, and then a hotly contested divorce, they'll be bringing transcripts in, wanting their spouse prosecuted for perjury and things like that. They're just real time consuming, but you take a look at it and see if there's enough evidence on something. But those were the main hurdles we had to cross, I guess, back in those days. It was kind of like they do now.
Talk to me about the public defenders. You're obviously familiar with them, and they also have a real huge caseload. Talk about who are some of the players and how important is that role?
Well, it's very important in the criminal justice system because every accused has a right to a lawyer. If they can't afford one, then the government has an obligation to provide a lawyer for them. And you know, back when I first started as a law clerk, Judge Cumming, we had a public defender system. Judge John Lineberger at that time was the public defender, but he was part-time. He had an assistant, John Barry Baker, that was full-time, but they couldn't do all the cases, and so the Judge Cummings would still appoint some attorneys. He'd call them up and get down here, I got a case I'm going to appoint you to represent sometimes, and the attorneys had an obligation to do so. And back then I don't think they were compensated at all for representing people, but Mike Dabney was later a deputy public defender for John Barry Baker, and Bob Estes, who was an attorney here in Fayetteville, he was a deputy public defender. Bob and I tried a lot of cases against each other when I was a deputy prosecutor and he was a deputy public defender, and we had a lot of good trials. And back in those days, a lot of the cases you tried not on the guilt or innocence, but on punishment, because a lot of them, in our state, the jury recommends the punishment, and the judge can't give more. He or she could give less, but if a jury comes back and finds them guilty of, let's say, theft, it carries 3 to 10 years imprisonment and or a $10,000 fine, they would recommend the punishment, and it was almost always a prison sentence of some sorts. But, you know, I may, as prosecutor, say, well, he's got a prior offense. I think he needs about 6 years instead of 3, the minimum. He's done this once before, and the public defender may think, well, I don't think a jury's going to give him more than 4 years. And so we go try it just to see what the punishment would be from the jury. But those were the main. Of course, Denny Highslip's been the appointed public defender for I don't know how many years, longer than I was on the bench, I think. As far as I know, he's still the public defender, and Denny's done a good job. He's been there a long time.
What about some of the lawyers? Who are if someone asks you, who are the top lawyers in Washington County?
Well, I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but, you know, a criminal defense that's still practicing, probably John Everett and W.H. Taylor, and back in the day it was Bill Putman. I tried several murder cases against Bill Putman, and he was the preeminent criminal trial lawyer in this area back in those days. And Bill Murphy tried a lot of criminal cases, Marshall Carlisle. Irwin Davis has tried quite a few. But those would be it for criminal, and there's so many good civil attorneys anymore. I don't know who I'd recommend. I mean, they're just lots of good attorneys out there.
What about some of the other judges? Tell me about, or obviously you know all the judges, but who are some of the ones that were there a long time, maybe that stand out that you remember?
Oh, you know, Judge Butt, 50 years on the bench. He was going to retire when he got sick, and I said, Judge, if you could just make it to January. And hold court in January. I forget what year this was, but he was very sick. I said, you'll make it 50 years. And he did, and he sat on the bench for 50 years. Chief Justice Jim Hanna and I put Judge Butt in for a big national award. I forget the name, the outfit that made this award, but he was able to get it, and we submitted documents and pictures and stories, and he received a big national award that they gave in New Orleans, I think it was presented. But Judge Butt was just a special judge. He was a chancellor when I started, and the chancellors heard all the divorce cases and probate cases and awarded child custody, and they had 6-year terms when they were elected for 6 years. And the circuit judges, which I was only a 4-year term. We did all the civil cases and criminal cases, and I always told Judge Butt, you get 2 more years on your term because you have to hear those child custody cases. And I'm sure glad I didn't have to hear those and try to decide those. But he was such a well-spoken judge, and fair and smart. And Judge Lineberger he was a good judge. I enjoyed working with him. When I first was on the bench, it was Judge Lineberger and Judge Butt were the 2 chancellors, and Judge Gibson was the criminal circuit judge, and I was he heard criminal cases. He wasn't a criminal, but he heard criminal cases. But I'd heard the civil cases, and so it was us 4 when I first started, and now I guess we're getting ready to get our 8th. I'll have to count them up, judge. But those are the ones I started with, and then Judge Mike Mashburn and Mary Ann Gunn, and of course Bill Story. Bill and I were judges together for 23 years, I guess, on the 4th floor up at the courthouse. And Judge Story's still judging as district judge here in Fayetteville.
What is Judge Story like?
Oh, he's just a great fella. He kind of intimidates a lot of attorneys, you know. He can be kind of gruff with them if he wants to be, but probably nothing that they didn't deserve. But he's just a fine fella, and I very much enjoy him. And we got along. He's always helping me if I had a trial going on and something else. He'd go, and he had time, he'd hear it, and then I'd say, hey, my case settled today, Shelley. That was his court reporter. His trial court assistant. And, if I can do some arraignments for Judge Story or something, let me know. And he rarely would call on you to help him out, and he'd have a jury trial going on. But he's just a great guy. I really enjoyed being on the bench at the same time that Judge Story was.
Tell me a little about John 3.
John 3?
I know you did mostly civil, but what was John like as a prosecutor?
He was a good trial attorney and a fair prosecutor, I always thought. I tried several. I had a percentage of the criminal cases back in those days, I think 15% for several years. And so John tried several jury trials in my court and was a real good prosecutor and fair, and I knew he'd be a fair judge too. He tries to know the law. There's some judges, the story is that judge doesn't know the law, nor do they even care. Does that judge even care about what the law is? But not our judges. John he's smart, and he knows the law, knows where to find it anyway.
What about the juvenile system? What's that been like?
Judge Zimmerman? Well, the county judges used to appoint, Bob I. Mays was our juvenile referee. Back in those days, according to statute, the county judge could appoint the juvenile referee. And Judge Lestval, I assume Vol Lester appointed Judge Mays as the juvenile referee, because when I was a law clerk, I used to go to juvenile court representing the prosecutor's office. Under Rule 15, you could do that if accompanied by an attorney. And Ron McCann came with me lots of times. And then, I forget, I think maybe in 1989 or 90, the Supreme Court declared that that was unconstitutional, that there needed to be an elected judge to be the juvenile judge. And so Governor Clinton appointed Bill Story as the juvenile judge. But from the time that the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional until Governor Clinton appointed juvenile referees, or juvenile judges, not referees, judges, we had to split up doing the juvenile caseload. So at that time, I was in the old Montgomery Ward building on the corner of Center and College, which has since been torn down. And the juvenile court was the floor above me. And so I'd run upstairs and do some of the juvenile delinquency cases and things that needed to be done. And the chancellor's, Judge Lineberger, did some of the offense cases, families in need of supervision, or juvenile in need of supervision, and Judge Butt did, and Judge Gibson. We all kind of pitched in and made sure all those cases got heard. And then Judge Story was appointed the juvenile judge. And then when that term that he got appointed was up, Judge Gibson was retiring as a circuit judge, and so Judge Story ran for that, and he didn't get an opponent. I never could figure out how you get to do that, because when I ran for something, I always had an opponent, it seemed like. But at least the first year, usually just the one time, and then if you do a decent job, I guess they leave you alone. But anyway, Judge Story was the new circuit judge and took Judge Gibson's place.
And then Charles Williams?
Charles Williams was elected juvenile judge and served in that capacity for many years. And then Judge Stacy Zimmerman, I forget what year Stacy became the juvenile judge, and she's done all the time since. When I was the administrative judge, as elected by the other judges, I was the first administrative judge. Every time we'd get ready to sign the cases and split up the caseload, I'd ask Judge Zimmerman if she's getting tired of hearing these juvenile cases, we can split them around, move them around and get other judges to help. No, I like it. I'm committed to these juveniles. And now I think we've got a new judgeship coming up in 2020 maybe. That's the story on the street is or maybe it was in the paper, that they're going to hear a lot of the juvenile cases too, to give Judge Zimmerman some relief, because there's so many cases in her court.
Talk about drug court. How has it, because that kind of started while you were in there, and what is drug court, and has it been effective?
Well, I think it has, although I'm not really up on the statistics, but Judge Story was the first drug court judge, I'm pretty sure it was, when they started. The first one was in Pulaski County, Jack Lessenberry, and I think that's right, Jack Lessenberry. Anyway, then we got one up here, and Judge Story presided over that drug court, and then Judge Gunn, of course, had it for many years, and now Judge Beaumont is the drug court judge. But I think it's good that it diverts them from the criminal justice system and gets them rehabilitation, and there's work requirements and come to court requirements. And, if they can get all that successfully done, then they don't have a record that follows them around. And I think that's a good thing, because it's awfully hard to get a good job if you've got a criminal record behind you. And, lots of people are suffering because of that. Well, one of my favorite characters that was a lawyer was W.Q. Hall from Madison County. And when I'd go over there to hold court, I scheduled court twice a month. I didn't always go twice a month. But many times I'd go eat lunch with W.Q. and listen to his stories. And I'd buy his lunch because he couldn't buy mine because I was a judge, you know, a circuit judge, and he was the district judge. But anyway, or we'd split lunch. But I'd get to hear stories from W.Q. Hall, and he's one of my favorite character attorneys. And the story on W.Q. was, which I asked him about, and he didn't really deny it. He didn't go into much detail, but he was a young lawyer in Huntsville and came over to the law school to do some research one evening, and the law library was closed. But they'd give the law review students that they'd have their own key to the law library, and they could go in and do their research and write their articles for the law review. I didn't make law reviews, so I didn't know much about that. But anyway, WQ wanted to research some issue and was over here and ran by the law school, and the door was locked, and he knocked on the door, and a student opened it, and he told WQ, said, I want to come in and do some, well, this is only for the law students. I'm sorry, I can't let you in. He shut the door and locked it. And so there was a fire extinguisher hanging on the wall, and WQ picked it up and threw it through the window and went in and did his research. And I asked him about that story that I'd heard, and he didn't deny it, but he didn't embellish on it very much. But he was a great character, and I sure enjoyed my visits with W.Q. Hall. Well, I was going to tell you some people that work for me. I've gone over when I was prosecutor, and David Van Beber, who was treasurer for Tyson Foods for many years, he was a law clerk for me. And Bob Gladwin was a law clerk for me, and then Bob Gladwin later was the deputy prosecutor for me, and then he was the district judge at Prairie Grove, and now he's a Court of Appeals judge, and he's done a lot. But David and Bob were real good clerks for me. I sure enjoyed them, and I think that's about it. Scotty McLaughlin used to be a deputy prosecutor for me. I was trying to think. I hope I haven't left anybody out.
Dale Evans?
He clerked for me. He was a law clerk. He wasn't a deputy prosecutor. Marshall Dale Evans was a law clerk in law school for me. He sure was.
If somebody asked you about Washington County, maybe somebody who'd never been to Washington County, didn't know anything about it, said, Judge, tell me about Washington County, what would you tell them?
Well, I'd tell them about the history, probably. I'm the immediate past president of the Washington County Historical Society, and I'm still on the board, so I enjoy that a lot. The history of Washington County, the history of Headquarters House, and I would also tell them it's full of great people, friendly people, and fair people on the most part. You know, I got help from lots of folks when I ran for prosecutor. Some people came to me and wanted me to run. I said, I don't know anybody. I was from Joplin, Missouri, and came down here to law school and then clerked for Malin, and said, I don't know very many people here, and I don't have any money. In fact, I was still paying back student loans to go to law school when they talked me into running for prosecutor, and I did, but I had so much help from Charlie Sanders and Clark McClinton and Hugh Brewer and lots of businessmen. I know I'm leaving some out up at Springdale, but lots of people. Charlie Sanders, I did mention Charlie at the paper, and Jim Morris, and lots of good folks here that I don't know why they helped a young guy like me, but I was sure fortunate that they did.
How would you finish this sentence? My favorite thing about Washington County is...
My favorite thing about Washington County is the people and the land, the beauty of this county and the people that's in it.